What a lovely sound. So it's interesting that that we've had some statements about prayer today, and I mean, I knew that we were going to pray for the Hawkfest, but I didn't know that Tim was going to read his verse. But this has just been on my heart a little bit, and so I wanted to bring a public service announcement, and I'll tell you what PSA actually stands for in a moment. All right, Tyler and I have been praying about a few situations recently, some pretty big ones. One of them's we just think is big. I don't know if you guys are like this, but if you're praying about a situation with money, do you ever feel like it's bigger than it really is? Like, I'm not an old man, but some of you think I'm a real old man, but I'm not yet. I'm not there. But so many times God has answered our needs that it seems like by now I would just say, oh, it's just a money need, and God will take care of it. But recently, there was a money issue that came up, and I prayed about it, and God answered it. And it was just a really good reminder that can happen, and God is not so small that he's not able to handle that. But there was an actual big issue that I had been praying about. And I don't know what it is about this current climate, but we've had multiple friends that are struggling in their marriage, and we've been praying about an issue. And I'm not going to tell you that prayer's been answered, but I'm going to tell you that this week I got the glimmerings of a start of an answer on that. And it was a beautiful text message, and I was so thankful to see it. And so I just wanted to remind you, maybe you're in a season right now where you need to be reminded that prayer accomplishes things, okay? And there are hundreds of places that we could point to, but I've just chosen one, Philippians chapter 4, where Paul writes and he says, "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. The Lord is at hand." And here's where we get our instruction. "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your request be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." So when I was growing up, when I was watching TV, every once in a while there would be this thing that would come across, and it was a PSA, a public service announcement, okay? And as Christians, our PSA doesn't stand for public service announcement. I'm going to encourage you to think this. You ready? Prayer settles anxiety, okay? Prayer settles anxiety. And the reason why I want to encourage you to think that way is because of this. We don't always get yeses to prayer, right? Has anyone in here always gotten a yes to prayer? Every time you've prayed? I have some things I'd like you to pray for. I'm just joking. Sorry. We don't always get yeses to prayer, but what we do get, and I believe is really one of the primary reasons God has given us prayer, is we get what is described here as the peace that surpasses all understanding. And so when I go to God about an issue that is causing me stress and anxiety, I believe that what happens is not always God saying, boom, that situation's gone, you're taken care of. Or, boom, you're moved to a new situation that's taken care of. But I believe quite often what happens is God says, you know what, Jonathan? I understand that you're tempted to feel that way and tempted to worry, tempted to anxiety, tempted to try and do things your own way. But what I will do is I will go through this with you. I will go through this with you. And that helps relieve the anxiety that I'm having. Because do not be anxious about anything. That's hard, right? That's a tough command. Do not be anxious about anything. And if it's just stop being anxious, I'm not sure that we're going to follow it well. But God doesn't say just stop being anxious. He says, don't be anxious. Instead, bring it to me. Bring it to God. And then you'll probably still be going through a situation, but you'll go through it with me, and you'll go through it with peace. And so I just want to remind us, because sometimes I need a reminder, Even though I've seen God answer prayer, sometimes I need a reminder. And you might be here today and you might need a reminder that God is listening to your prayers. God is working. God is able. Don't be anxious about anything, but instead, in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. So that's all free. It's not in 2 Corinthians, so that's just bonus, all right? But now we're going to continue into our series, okay? So we've been looking at, this buzzes now. Does this always buzz? I just clicked it and it, neat, I'm sorry, all right. I don't remember that happening. So we're in 2 Corinthians and we're finishing up the book this week and next week. And Pastor David gave us a great introduction to this transition in the book of 2 Corinthians. If you sit down and you read the whole book of 2 Corinthians all at once, which is definitely possible, I would even encourage you to do so, you'll notice that in 2 Corinthians 10, Paul sort of switches gears, okay? And up to that point, Paul's been talking to the church and giving instruction and giving encouragement and all of these things. But then in chapter 10, there's a gear that's switched, and he changes his tone. He changes his real the thrust of the letter. And so last week we looked at chapter 10, and this week we're going to start in verse 11 and get a little bit into 12. But this is in this new section of 2 Corinthians. And it's quite long, but I don't have all of it on the screen, but I have a few verses that we're going to use as our springboards, okay? So I want to encourage you. Don't just say, that's obviously what it says. Go and read 2 Corinthians chapter 11 all the way through to verse 10 of chapter 12 and see if it says what I'm offering to you. But these are our springboard verses that we're going to use. It says this. But the first verse I have here is verse 21. But whatever anyone else dares to boast of, I am speaking as a fool. I also dare to boast of that. If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. I had to spend a little time in prayer because when the other pastors and I were thinking about the schedule, they read this portion and they said, Jonathan, this would be perfect for you. I'm speaking as a fool. I'm just kidding. They didn't do that. But if they did, it would have been in good fun, I promise. So this section is a difficult section because what we get to see here is one of those difficult peeks behind the curtain into Paul, okay? I don't know if you've read all of what Paul wrote, but some of the things that Paul writes, I think he might have been hard to get along with, okay? Anybody ever think that? Anybody think if I sat down with Paul, it might have been a challenge to get along with Paul, okay? Now, I don't mean that we couldn't, and I don't mean that he always was, and he actually even talks about some of this in this section of the Bible, okay? But there's some challenging passages that Paul writes. So before we get and talk about all of these things, let's look at it little by little, right? Little by little. What is Paul's example here in this, okay? I don't think everything that we read is a command or instructional or prescriptive for us, but what is Paul's example that we can follow here, okay? First off, he starts in this section with very clear concern in chapter 11. His concern for Corinth is obvious, okay? He's clearly concerned with this group of believers that he has been involved with and helped to get this church, in its infancy to begin and all these things. And he says it just in verse 3, he says it this way, I'm afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. So starting in chapter 10 and then on into 11, we get to see some of Paul's concern and why he's concerned about the church in Corinth. And it's because they're kind of wishy-washy. All right? Do you guys know wishy-washy? Is that something that we say here? I don't know how to say wishy-washy in Thai, but wishy-washy is this. Now, I'm a big guy, and so normally I think I could stand even if you pushed me. But if I'm doing this, how many of you think you could push me over? So you're like, wait, that's uncomfortable. I'm not supposed to push people over at church. If we were at 7-Eleven, do you think you could push me over, right? All you have to do is time it, right? If I'm doing this, boom, now I'm over, right? Wishy-washy is easy to push over, okay? And the church at Corinth was looking like they were easy to push over. He says, in this section at the beginning of chapter 11, he says, if I am coming here and saying foolishness, you'll probably put up with it because you seem to have no problem putting up with foolishness, all right? This is a very parental section that Paul's writing, okay? I can sort of hear my parents. Like I can hear the voice of my mom saying, well, Jonathan, I guess the dishes will just do themselves, right? Like, that kind of a thing. But Paul is writing here and he says, what's wrong with you guys? Now, this isn't the only passage where Paul shows his concern for the churches that he worked with. One of my favorite passages where he does this is in Galatians chapter 5. Galatians chapter 5, he talks to the church at Galatia and he says it this way. He says, you were running well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? Now, this is the lead-in to a very famous passage that Paul writes. Later on in this chapter, we get to see anybody know what's in this passage? If we were to do like a Bible trivia quiz, what's later on in Galatians chapter 5? I heard it, I think. Fruits of the Spirit, right? All right, fruit of the Spirit, right? Now, so before he gets into that, he tells them this. You were running so well. What stopped you? What stopped you? And this is one of those challenges that are uncomfortable, right? When we started dating, this is going to be like one of those uncomfortable windows into people's souls. This is going to be tough. Mine. So when we started dating, I don't know if it's everybody, but for me, when we started dating, I would like run through these what-if scenarios. Like we'd go and we'd sit at the table and we'd eat at Applebee's or some other dangerous place. And I would go through these what-if like situations, and I'd be like, what would happen if somebody came and like tried to abduct her? And I would go through these stupid what-if scenarios where I'm like, well, you know what? Let me just sit on the same side of the booth, right? And then that's taken care of, right? And then when we had kids, oh, heavens, the what-if scenarios. What if is a bad game to play, and parents play it all the time, and like, just so worried. And I have these thoughts like, how am I going to protect them from the dangers? But listen, the older I've gotten, this is one of the most uncomfortable truths I've ever seen, okay? I don't usually have to protect Tyler from the people out there who are coming in with danger. Way more likely, I need to protect Tyler from the foolishness coming out of my mouth or from the idiotic actions that I do, right? I don't generally have to protect my children from they coming in with danger. I have to protect them from the quick anger coming from my mouth or from the quick answer that comes. And I don't want to paint a picture like, Lord, I hope that that's not everything that they have to deal with. But I am telling you that there are times where that is what they needed protection from. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? It's usually not they outside. it's usually me. Everybody point to me. I'm not me. Point to me. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? 9 times out of 10, me. In the Corinth church, they were dealing with a lot of false teachers, the people that were coming in and trying to take advantage and trying to persuade and trying to create opportunities for their own gain. And there were opponents outside, but ultimately those opponents didn't force them to follow. Ultimately, they chose to follow. So this concern for Corinth is in a lot of ways, I believe, Paul trying to help them learn a lesson that I'm trying to learn. And that learned lesson is hopefully remember to protect from yourself, okay? Watch your own actions, watch your own mouth. When I was growing up, there was a song we used to sing all the time. It was oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see. Anybody know that one? And it would go through all the senses. It'd be, oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see. And be careful, I don't know if it did nose. Be careful what you, I don't think it did nose. But be careful, little mouth, what you say. And be careful, little hands, what you do. And be careful, little ears, what you hear. Nose just got a bad rap on that, didn't they? Huh. Anyway, and so that's sort of where I think this concern is going. Paul's saying, be careful, young Christians, what you're doing, because you could be led astray. Be careful. Now, he doesn't stay there, okay, because he's been in the whole letter talking to the Corinthian church about how to be more mature in their walk with God, how to grow, the actions that they should do, the choices that they should make, all these things. But he does move into this section where he starts to answer some of their complaints. A few years ago, when I was finishing my master's, I started sending resumes out to churches, okay? Pastor David, you send resumes out to churches? No? That you were wise. You came out here to the mission field and said, no resume. Let's see here. Pastor Sue, you send resumes out to churches? All right, I don't know if you got this experience, but this is, so I would send a resume out to church, and a little while later, I'd get this back, all right? Now, I just was finishing my master's. I was 20, how old was I? 25-ish, I don't know, somewhere around there, okay? And I'd get a letter back that would be some kind of a combination of this, okay? It would be like, dear Mr. Jonathan, you know, dear sir. They often say, dear sir. Like, oh, this is going to be a good letter. Unfortunately, we're looking for someone different. We're looking for someone that has more experience, okay, which is perfectly reasonable. I'm not knocking that. They want more experience, all right? But they wanted lots of experience and very young. We're looking for a 25-year-old with approximately 15 years experience in the pulpit, speaks 5 languages, can parse the Greek, and this and that, right? But it was like, you know, like, it's okay to want a young pastor. It's okay to want a pastor that's got experience, but it's going to be hard to get that kind of a perfect scenario, right? Paul was dealing with that kind of unreasonable expectation, unreasonable accusations. If you read the books of 1st and 2nd Corinthians, you'll see some kind of combination of this. Like at one point, the church at Corinth is basically bad-mouthing Paul because he would not take a salary from them. He would not take money from them, all right? So if Andy comes over and he does, what kind of work are you going to do for me? He's going to write my sermon, okay? All right, so he comes over and he writes my sermon, and then I'm like, okay, Andy, thank you so much for the work that you've done. Here's some money. And Andy says, no, I can't take it. Can you say you won't take it? Oh, okay, all right. And then they're starting to badmouth it. They're like, I cannot believe that Andy came over and working at our church and then won't even take money from it. Now, can you imagine a church complaining about that, right? But they were. They were like, I cannot believe Paul would come to work at our church and wouldn't even take money from us, all right? But then they have this accusation about the same guy, about Paul. This one, you ready? Did you hear what Andy did with all the money he took from us? I heard that he went right from here to Shake Shack and bought all the milkshakes that they had, right? How can you complain about someone taking money and using it irresponsibly and not taking money at all at the same time? Listen, the reason you can do that is because people are broken, and we will find a way to complain if we want to complain, okay? It doesn't have to make sense when we want to complain. But that's just a little taste of what the people of Corinth were complaining about Paul with. Like, Paul's this and he's that. And oftentimes, it was the opposite sides of the same coin. Like, how can he be both? I don't know. They're complaining about it. So Paul moves in very quickly in the chapter 11 of 2 Corinthians into what I'm calling the defensive offensive. It sounded good when I wrote it. It made me, I was like, oh, that's a clever wordplay. But then I thought about it, and I was like, I don't think it's very clever. But if you watch any sports commentators, sometimes they will say this statement. You ready? The best offense is a good defense. I feel like we're kind of back on the thing where we're complaining about Paul on the same thing, right? But the best offense is a good defense. Well, what is the best defense? A good offense. You know what the change is? What position you play, right? If I'm a striker, the best defense is a good offense. And if I'm a goalie, the best offense is a good defense, right? Yeah, because that's the position I play, right? Yeah. So Paul launches into this, okay? He says this. And this is the section where he says the statement like, I'm being foolish right now. He says this: to my shame, I must say, we were too weak for that. But whatever anyone else dares to boast of, I'm speaking as a fool, I also dare to boast of that, all right? So he talks about the folks that were trying to lead the people at Corinth astray, and he tells them, like, you're being so patient with these opponents, these people that are false teachers. You're being so patient with them that you're willing to take all of this, these insults and these, if they slapped you, you would probably just offer your face to get slapped again. All of these things, he says, and this is where he says, to my shame, I must say, we were too weak for that. Now this, if you are a fan of sarcasm, this is a Paul sarcasm passage, okay? He talks about all the folks that were leading the Corinth church wrong, and he says, oh, I must say, to my shame, we were too weak for that, okay? And he's not literally saying, I'm too weak to do what they did. They hit you, but I can't. He's saying, oh, we were just too weak. We were just too weak. He says, we were just trying to be too Jesus to you, all right? Right? At a Christian church, he's saying, oh, sorry, we were just trying to be too Christ-like, right? Isn't that the goal? Isn't that what we're going for? And Paul says, I guess we were just too weak for it. And then he starts to move into this transition. He says, but listen, whatever anybody else can boast of, and I'm speaking as a fool, I also dare to boast of that. And then he launches into it. He says, are they Hebrews? I am Hebrew of Hebrews. Are they Pharisees? I am a Pharisee of Pharisees. Have they done this? Did they go to this school? Did they get that GPA? Did they get this honor cord? Did they, did they write this letter? Did they do this? Did they go here? Did they, all of this? And he says, and I have too. This section is sort of characterized with the words, it buzzed, but it's not going. Oh, there it goes. All right, sort of characterized with these words. So am I, so do I. They do this, so do I. They are this, so am I. Paul says, listen, if you're looking for someone who has, quote, the resume to follow, here. Look at this resume. And then after he goes through, this is what they're claiming, and so am I, then he goes into this section, and this is a difficult section, because if you've ever been told, or maybe you think, that everything about Christianity is very pleasant, and if you come to Jesus, everything will work out well for you, then you need to not read 2 Corinthians chapter 11, because in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul talks about some of the things that happened in his life after he started following Jesus. okay? And like the most comfortable part of that section is he got shipwrecked. Like the most comfortable part of that section is he got shipwrecked and beaten and stoned and left for dead and all of these things. And he goes through this like, hold on. Seriously? Hold on. So Paul is working with the church who's been tempted to go away from the true gospel because people have come into their midst and they've talked so fancily and they've done this and they've done that and they're popular and this and that happens and so they're tempted to go away, and Paul lets himself for a little while tell them, if these are the qualities you're looking for, check these out. Here you go. But I want us to understand that this part of Paul's example, it's very important that we don't just look at this small section of the chapter, because it would be tempting for us to go away and think, oh, we're supposed to share our Christian resume, our Christian battle scars, these things that we've endured. We've endured these for Jesus. Look what I've done for Jesus. But Paul doesn't stop here. In fact, the whole point of this section is for him to be able to share with the people of Corinth that it is not these things that he is relying on. He's not relying on these things. I'm sorry, Miss Lynn, this ain't working right now. Could you, thank you so much. This is not the resume. Sorry, my accent went out there for a minute. This ain't the resume. This is not the resume that Paul is relying on. Sure, he's been shipwrecked. He's been beaten. He's been left for dead. He's been all of these things. Soon, he's about to be arrested, live in Rome for a while, on his way to get beheaded. All of these things are true. This is all going to happen. But it's not what he's relying on. Paul's not saying, look at what I've done. Check this out. He's setting up the stage so that he can point the Corinthian church to the same thing he is relying on, which he's talked to the Corinthian church about multiple times. We've looked at a couple of times, and it's this weird, paradoxical statement, especially to us as humans, because we as humans know strength is strength, right? Strength is strength. Strong is strong. Strong, right? We know what strength is. We know what strong is. We understand that. And Paul is about to flip the stage on us, and he's going to tell us once again, if you're going to follow Jesus, you need to understand that the things that you thought you knew might very well be upside down. And he says, this is who I am. This is what I've done. This is where I've gone. I've done all this. I've gone through all this. I've endured all this, but I'm not relying on that. I'm not going to the same source of authority that his opponents were going to. Because the people trying to lead the Corinthian church away, that's all they were doing. They were pointing to, look at how well I speak. Look at what I've written. Look at all of the things that I've done. And Paul says, no, that's not what I'm going to point to. What I'm going to tell you is, I am pleased to boast in my weakness. Boast in my weakness. Wait. How weak are you if you survive being shipwrecked multiple times? If you survive taking the beatings that Paul took, or being stoned and left for dead? Surely that means that he's got to be fairly strong, right? Paul says, no, I'm going to boast in my weakness. We can just go to the whole next slide. Boast in my weakness. This is what he says. He says it this way. But he said to me, this is Paul talking about God, because what happens in the first part of chapter 12 is Paul says, listen, God gave me a gift. Ooh, we like gifts, right? God gave me a gift of a thorn in the side, okay? Wait, thorn sounds uncomfortable. Can we go back to gift? And Paul says, this thorn in the side was so that I would be dependent on God. So I would remember that I need God. God doesn't need me, okay? And he says, this gift was here, and I prayed multiple times. We talked about prayer a minute ago. He says, I prayed to God that he would remove this thorn in my side. We don't know exactly what it was. There's all kinds of books been written about it. People have really good speculations about it, and it's fun to dive into. But ultimately, we don't know what it was. And I think that that's actually the point, is we don't know what it was. He prayed and asked God to remove this thorn from him. And this is the answer that he records. He says, but God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul has set this stage so that he can deliver this message with the most stark contrast he can provide, okay? He didn't just start off, I'm boasting in weakness. He wanted to set the stage that Paul, the writer of so much of the New Testament, was relying on his weaknesses, not his educational background, not his missionary journeys, not his meeting with Jesus on the road to Damascus, not all of these things. He's not relying on that. He's relying on his weakness, not because weakness is so good in itself, but because weakness sets the stage perfectly for God to be made more clear in his life. God told him, I'm not going to remove the thorn because it's the thorn that shows you your weakness. And when you know you're weak, I'll show up and I'll be your strength. This is not the first time we've seen this kind of a message, even in 2 Corinthians. Earlier in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul's talking to the Corinthian church, and he talks about how as Christians we are holding this treasure in jars of clay. And this is the way he phrases it in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7. One second, let me flip there. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7, it says, but we have this treasure in jars of clay, to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. What's Paul's example here? I don't think Paul's example is for us to brag, quote unquote, or even Christian brag, quote unquote, about all the things that we've endured, all the places that we've gone, all the things that have happened, all of the stuff that we've gone through. The example that Paul gives us here is for us to point with everything that we have and all the opportunity that we receive to the fact that it is really not about Jonathan in Jonathan's life. It's really not about the Finleys in the Finleys' life. It's really not about BCF in the life of BCF. It's really about Jesus, about Jesus, about Jesus. And the more people see, wait, it's so strange. I know them, and I know they're not perfect. I've seen that they're not perfect. If they were a container at the container store, they would be clay, which is not known for its durability if you hit it with something. It's not known for its beauty unless you make it beautiful. They'd be clay. If they're clay, what is it about them that's drawing me to them? What can I be so curious about? And those are the opportunities for us to say, it's not about us, it's about Jesus. Paul's example in this portion of Corinthians, I believe, is for us to remember that our weaknesses are an opportunity for us to proclaim Jesus' surpassing power. able even to surpass my failures. Let's share Jesus with the world around us that is sadly convinced that strength is strength, not the other way around. Father, I thank you for the comfort that we have in your word. I thank you that you filled your team with people that answered quickly or put their foot in their mouth or went to run ahead, Lord. I thank you that you surrounded yourself with people who were broken, just like we're broken. And I thank you that the example that we can get from that is that if you can use them, perhaps you can even use us. Father, thank you that you have the surpassing power. Would you help us to offer you with what little we have so that your kingdom may be made more famous, your name may be made more known, and your kingdom would grow here in Bangkok and around the world. In Jesus' name, amen.